So what is ubiquitous assimilation?
Always absorbing everything everywhere all the time.
How are you to imagine anything if the images are always provided for you? Who here read 1984 last year? Good. Anyone? Meredith?
Having two opposing beliefs at once and believing that both are true.
Excellent, Meredith. To deliberately believe in lies while knowing they're false. Examples of this in everyday life. Oh, I need to be pretty to be happy. I need surgery to be pretty. I need to be thin, famous, fashionable. This is a marketing holocaust. 24 hours a day. For the rest of our lives, the powers that be are hard at work, dumbing us to death. So, to defend ourselves and fight against assimilating this dullness into our thought processes, we must learn to read, to stimulate our own imaginations, to cultivate our own consciousness, our own belief systems. We all need these skills to defend, to preserve our own minds.
Welcome to Aeon Byte, everybody, and welcome to that clip from the movie Detachment, the great Adrian Brody telling us how it is and where we're heading. And that movie's like more than 10 years old, and my God, it's truer than ever. And in a way, it is a form of magic, what they're doing to us. The corporations, the government, and all that, they're dulling our minds and rewriting our psyches. Of course, I'm more in the realm of John Michael Greer and his ideas of magic and how they can just change reality. And I think it will relate to our topic tonight. My name is Miguel Connor. I am your Pompatus of Gnosis, and it's always so good to see you. This is a special Patreon AB Prime member stream just for you, early for you, and you get to ask questions without worries about super chats. And again, you get it early. And tonight's topic is an incredible topic, and it's a book that I really enjoyed. With us to discuss all of this, we have Richard Kaczynski to discuss his excellent book, Mind Over Magick, the Psychology of Ritual Magick. Richard, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Oh, you're welcome. It's my pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the invitation to come on.
Pleasure is all ours. And with us, too, we've got the Moondog Vance. Vance, how are you doing over there in the set of The Prisoner? Still haven't been able to get out yet?
Nope, still locked into the control room here, but maybe I'll use a little magic to get myself out someday.
Yeah. Well, hopefully it'll work for you. Awesome. Yes, again, this is a special stream. So if you are watching from Patreon or any of the other links, just let us know your questions or just enjoy. Again, this is a bonus. It's an early show. And for those who are listening the pre-recorded later on, as always, please support Aeon Byte. Join the Patreon, the AB Prime, and you get a whole lot of bonuses. So... But that's it. I don't want to get carried away with the promotion. I want to talk about this excellent topic. So, Richard, I had to laugh because I love the way you start your book. You start with, your resume is impressive, but. And it reminds me, there's the old Game of Thrones, Jon Snow, where he learned that everything before but is bullshit. And that sets you on your journey. Tell the audience about... this job interview that changed your life.
Sure thing. Well, it wasn't quite as bad as You Know Nothing, Jon Snow, but it was the situation where I had been on the faculty of the School of Medicine at Wayne State University in Detroit for 10 years. And one of those things you do as faculty is you keep track of your activities to kind of make your case for tenure when that time comes. And tenure comes in various shapes and forms of, like, it's teaching you've done, it's research, but it's also community service. And I've done a lot of lectures for, the public, for, metaphysical and occult groups about my interests related to my dissertation topic, which was metaphysical beliefs. And that was told, yes, all that stuff definitely counts as community service as an expert. You should put that on your resume or your CV, as we call it in academia. So fast forward, 10 years later, and I'm applying for a research position at Yale University with this CV chock full of all these references to talks I've given on, magic and the occult and stuff, to, pagan conferences and whatnot. And the interviewer, and I have also, a good selection of solid academic articles as well that I've done in my years. But the interviewer says, well, your resume is very impressive, but what's with all this religion stuff? Because it's kind of an odd topic in psychology. It was when I was in graduate school, and it's become a little bit more accepted, but it's still kind of unusual as a focus, particularly in the School of Medicine, where they're kind of concerned with, either mental health or, various types of mental pathology.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't really prepared to answer that question, but I just sat back and really thought about, well, what is it about all this magic stuff or this religion stuff? And I answered honestly. And what I said was that for me, our regular state of consciousness, the state of consciousness where we get up, we eat breakfast, we drive to work, we do our job, and we don't really think too much about it, doesn't tell us a whole lot about how our brains work. We're kind of mostly on autopilot, and it's when our brain does weird things, when we have these transformative religious experiences or other sorts of liminal encounters where things don't go quite as you expected, and it seems to break the rules. People who have transformative religious experience, for instance, can have dramatic changes in their personality, and personalities generally assumed to be stable.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, I was saying that's where all the interesting stuff happens. How do we explain that? What does that tell us about human psychology? It's kind of like a car. You can get in a car and you can drive it, but it's not until it breaks down that you realize what an alternator is or a battery is or how it works. And that was my approach to psychology. And the HR person sat back and went, yeah, that makes sense. So
I'm sure they want to know.
That's the best policy.
Did you get the job?
I did.
Yeah, awesome. So yeah, it's interesting because as you mentioned Jung in your book, and he did a dissertation on a seance, I think, of his cousin, and of course he was always running, he was walking that thin line between mysticism and science, which seems to be your path too, right?
Yeah. I certainly try to keep, as a psychologist and a researcher, I try to keep one foot very firmly in the science realm. And with this book, I was very conscious to focus on actual peer-reviewed, published research, not like theory and speculation, but actual, evidence, obtained doing, research and, laboratory methods and those sorts of, evidence-based approaches.
Exactly. At the same time, as you write, you had a few mystic or like paranormal experiences as a child, seeing things that were out of this world, right? And you became you're a practicing magician. So again, you are straddling both worlds. Why did you decide to get into psychology?
Well, as you mentioned, from a very young age, I'd seen, like ghosts, and that, like, and it wasn't just me, it's like my siblings as well. We all had like weird things that we saw in the house. And one of the stories I tell in the book that's kind of interesting is that, mom poo-pooed all these stories and just that's
Just
just
your
imagination.
imagination.
Yeah. No, never mind, you're making it up. And then one day my siblings and I were all sitting around for Thanksgiving dinner. And this was after my father had died, and it was just, my two sisters and I and mom. And for some reason, even though she always poo-pooed us and, kind of discouraged that kind of talk, it came up in that particular dinner. And we started comparing notes about, remember when this weird thing happened? Oh, yeah, I had this kind of thing happen as well. And mom just kind of sat back and said, yeah, all that stuff stopped after Dad died. And it was like one of those pulling the rugs out from underneath you kind of moments, because not only is she basically admitting, yes, there was something going on all those years, but somehow it was connected to Dad, then what does that even mean? But anyway, it was these sorts of things that I was surrounded by my whole life that kind of led to an interest in paranormal sorts of things of all kinds, and this kind of dovetailed with my childhood fascination with Star Trek. And then when Leonard Nimoy started hosting the In Search of TV show,
Great show.
That was like my gateway. It's like the Star Trek to In Search of to occultist sort of pipeline was very real for me. And so when I had the opportunity to go to college, I was thinking, what kind of major did I want? And I decided I wanted to pursue psychology in hopes of finding some answers in human psychology to explain these things that I was not only experiencing, but also just studying and very interested in, and that lots of other people were also, actively involved in.
Exactly. Awesome. Well, thanks for sharing. I think, Vince, I already see a question since there's a handful of people.
Yeah.
And it dovetails with what we're talking about.
Good start.
Here we go. Anon, our friend Anon, wants to know what your most profound paranormal experience was.
Oh, that's a tricky one because it covers a lot of ground. I think I'll share something that I talk about in the book as well. So that way, if you pick up the book, you can find this story for yourselves. But at one point, I kind of became aware of a large shadowy figure that seemed to be hanging around my neighborhood and my house. And it was a human-shaped figure. It was as tall as our neighbor's garage. And when I measured that, it was like 9 feet to the roof line or so. And, my, young teen me was like, what could that possibly be? And there were footprints left behind in my mom's garden. And I concluded, this obviously must be Bigfoot. What else could it be? Yeah. I mean, yeah, like Bigfoot is living in suburban Detroit. But never mind that. That didn't occur. That didn't stop me from thinking that was the case. And so I went on this mission of kind of exploring my neighborhood, and there were like neighboring woods and things like that hadn't been developed yet. And at one point in my explorations, I came to this clearing, and there was this big fence between me and the General Motors Technical Center, adjoining it. And on the other side of the fence, I saw as clear as day Bigfoot. Not just any Bigfoot, but it was Andre the Giant portraying Bigfoot from the $6 Million Man. And
Yeah.
I just screamed and ran all the way home. And it's a scene it's a memory that's vivid in my memory to this day. And as I say in the book, clearly Andre the Giant was not living in my neighborhood. Bigfoot was not living in my neighborhood. But at the same time, there was something going on. There was something that was, there was a shadowy figure. There was something that left footprints. There was something that I saw that clearly was not Andre the Giant, but it was something. And that's the point. These sorts of experiences are not nothing. They may not be what we perceive them to be, but there's certainly something going on in these sorts of experiences. We can laugh about it, but it's something that happens to a large number of people. And I'm not talking specifically, seeing, Bigfoot in your backyard as a little kid, but it's any kind of, UFO encounters. It's, encounter with angels, or transformative religious experiences, any sort of encounter with the numinous or the liminal. It's very common. And while those sorts of experiences tend to be easy to ridicule, the fact of the matter is they're exceedingly common. And, one writer that I cite in the book says it's actually kind of out of the norm for someone not to have had one of these experiences somewhere in their life.
Exactly.
And so by bringing up this potentially like embarrassing story from my childhood, my object there in bringing this up is to kind of say, hey, we kind of need to destigmatize this. There shouldn't be shame in talking about this, because everyone's had something, some dream where they were visited by a dead relative or something. And because it's a natural part of human experience, it's something we should be able to talk about without fear of ridicule. And again, it kind of goes back to that story I told, at the beginning. I mean, this is where like human psychology gets interesting. It's like, what is going on there? Let's talk about that.
What kind of footprints were they? Was it a bare foot, or was it like a shoe? Was there any detail in the footprint?
Yeah, I mean, it was toes and stuff. It was, I forget exactly how big it was, but there is a photo in the book where I dutifully got out my mom's sewing tape measure and laid it out next to the footprint and took a photo with the Kodak Instamatic camera.
Cool.
And somehow I managed to save that photo to this day, but it's kind of yellowed and faded over the years. But I tried to restore the photo as best I can to include in the book. But it's like it's 2 feet long. I forget the exact length of it. Would it be like a ridiculously large shoe size if it were a shoe?
Wow.
There's a picture too of Lee Majors and Under the Giant. So it brings back memories. When you were a kid, did you try going in slow motion to catch up to the?
It was really important for me to get the permission to use that photo, because it was such a vivid memory in my mind. But also, it's that how many people reading this book today would know what I meant by Under the Giant portraying Bigfoot? I mean. There's a lot of people who did not have the benefit of growing up with that TV show.
And so, I mean, again, bringing up Jung, obviously, Jung was also one, he tried the balance between the mystic experience, the numinous, and the rational mind. He got in hot water with Freud and so many others in the scientific community. Psychology, obviously, is pretty much secular unless you go to the parapsychology. So and you talk about Jung and synchronicity, and Jung always said these things are an empirical reality, UFOs, that we see them and they are there. And he was a phenomenologist, so he always tried to understand people in their own reality. Do you see where you differ from Jung, or where Jung went wrong, or what's your take on him, Richard?
Yeah, I don't really spend a whole lot of time on Jung, even though I think the idea of synchronicity is an interesting one, because it gets into, the idea of the perceiver effect. I mean, it's someone else can't tell whether something is a synchronicity for somebody else, because it's not just a coincidence of 2 or 3 events. It is it's a lining up of events that are important to that person. Right. So there's a subjective component to it. And so that really kind of opens up the door for me to talk about things like how well humans can estimate or predict randomness or probability. And, a spoiler, we're actually pretty poor at judging how likely or unlikely something is, or, assessing randomness. But by and large, I don't spend a lot of time on Jung for the reason that Karl Popper, philosopher of science, kind of talks about how there's a difference between a theoretical model, and things like Freud's psychoanalysis and Jung's depth psychology, they're very useful frameworks for therapy and trying to understand how the psyche works. But in terms of science, they're very difficult to test. They're what Popper would say are non-falsifiable. And so for the purposes of this book, I wanted to stick to actual, again, empirical research. Part of my goal with that is to be able to write a book and to present an argument that even a skeptic, I would hope, could read this and kind of agree and say, okay, I see the case that you're making here. Because I'm not delving into Jung, and you mentioned parapsychology, and while that's a fascinating bit of research, and I do talk a little bit about that as well, that's not the focus of the book either, because I didn't want people to pick this up and go, oh, that's hogwash, because that is a tendency for a lot of people. If they can't explain it, doesn't fit their preconceptions about science, they will dismiss it outright. And I didn't want that to happen here, so I kind of wanted to stick to the more middle of the road sorts of research studies, which still, nevertheless, when you put all the pieces together, tell what I think is a very interesting story.
It is very, very true of that. And for example, maybe you can, excuse me, talk to the audience about the ritualist optimal state of mind, to which, well-known psychological concept used in describing athletes and performers. Could you tell the audience about that and how it ties into ritual magic?
Sure. One of the things I talk about, and what you're alluding to there, is the flow state.
Right, exactly.
It's a state of mind that athletes, musicians, and other performers, people who have a craft that they have honed for many years, where their responses, whether it be, improvising a melodic solo, whether it be response to some activity on, the playing field or what have you, has been so well practiced, so rehearsed mentally and physically, that there's a point where you can relax, the muscle memory kicks in, all that training takes over, and everything kind of happens effortlessly. And it's not a thing that you can easily just get into. It's also one of those things like where if you think about it, you're not in your flow state anymore. You're kind of watching yourself. It's kind of like there's an old, story about the young student who goes to his guru and says, "Oh, master, how can I become enlightened?" And the master says, "If you can wade out to the Ganges to your waist, but never once think about your belly button, you will be enlightened." And the student comes back and says, "Oh, master, I've tried, but all I can do is think of my belly button." And then the guru says, "Yes, when you can not think about that, that's when you will be enlightened." And it's kind of the same thing with the flow state. You're in it, you're just vibing, you're not even conscious of what you're doing. Time, has no meaning. You're just in this fully engaged, fully absorbed, blissed out sort of state of doing your craft. And there's a lot of parallels there to what a ritual magician would be experiencing, because similarly they have rituals they practice every day, and things that they memorize, so that these correspondences and other associations, I'm associating this particular smell with this thing, or I'm this sound with this thing, is built up. And when you're in a ritual, it's these things then come into play. In a similar way, when I look at sports medicine sorts or sports psychology articles, as I do in the book, where people talk about how athletes can train and prepare to more easily get into the zone, it's literally the sorts of things that magicians do. And again, I use the term magician very broadly, anyone who engages in a regular spiritual practice of some sort. But it's things like, keep a diary, do visualization exercises, be present in the moment, do breathing exercises. I mean, I was just reading this article, and it's just like, holy cow, this is just straight up, magical practice. But that's what these athletes are being trained to do as well. And the idea is that as you practice these techniques, getting into that flow state, which, again, is also, it's an altered state of consciousness, like getting into that liminal state,
Right.
it becomes more easy. And that's part of what is happening, I argue, with these various magical practices, that it gives its practitioners this advantage. It helps open those doors to more easily get into these sorts of liminal states where these spiritual encounters or spiritual transformation becomes possible.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and I kind of approach this, I guess I should clarify, kind of from the definition of magic that Aleister Crowley uses. So I think it's kind of useful, because he says that magic is the art and science of causing change to occur in conformity with will. And so you got this idea that it's an intentional change. And then by his definition, blowing your nose is an intentional change. But I think, kind of backing up a little bit, I like that first part that says that magic is the art and science. There's two pieces to this equation, and Mind Over Magic focuses on the science part. There's also some art. It's like, I can explain, okay, man, the psychologically speaking, these practices get you into this state of consciousness, this altered state where change is possible. What happens there is, an indescribable something, and people can make of that what they will. And that's someplace where things like Jung or, parapsychology or, Rupert Sheldrake's formative causation or any of these other things can come into play. I don't necessarily go there with this book, because there's plenty of other things to talk about, but there's that whole other thing that's going on that's still outside the realm of psychology.
Of course, yeah. I love what you said about the Zen master, because I'm the same way. I'll be meditating and I'm like, oh, I am finally in the zone. I'm not thinking, oh, I just thought that. And I got to go right back to the deep breathing. And you're right about athletes getting in the zone. And we have to admit, some of the most superstitious people in the world are athletes, right? They have their eating at the certain time, the same object, same ritual, same, you know what I mean? They in a way, they're magicians, right? When you talk about it. And I think the magician and the athlete, yeah, they're trying to get past their conscious mind, their frontal lobe, and get into the larger place of the mind where, like you said, everything flows, where the real goal is.
If an athlete has a particular, like, lucky jersey or whatever, or a pair of socks they have to wear,
he believes in that 100%. Yeah.
Yeah, that's not terribly different from the idea that, a magician, may have particular vestments they may put on when they're in ritual, or if you're doing yoga, you may put on your yoga pants, or, if you're, a Wiccan, you may take off your clothes, but you're changing your outward appearance with, what you're wearing or not wearing to help you get into that state of mind. So, I mean, again, very clear parallels between the two.
Yeah, I think Mitch Horowitz's definition is, I think, causal ritual that creates a cause. So he's kind of there, if you would. And Vance, what do you think, or do you have a question?
I do have a question. That's magic, because I was just thinking, hey, I'd like to ask Richard the following, which
Got
is
into our minds, Richard. Watch out.
which is there's multiple places that you can cause an effect, right? There's the physical and the mental and the spiritual. So I was wondering what you had to say about, the range of magic, if there are different types of magic and rituals for the different targets in the different realms.
Yes, some of these things are easier to speak about from a psychology standpoint than others. I mean, the spiritual is hard to talk about from psychology, because it's not a thing that's necessarily inherently psychological. I'm reminded of a metaphor from Bill Moyer, who was the guy that interviewed Joseph Campbell for the myth series that he did, and The Power of Myth. And Bill Moyers has this metaphor that he used in one of his interviews where he says that dogs can find a lot of information about the world using their nose. They can smell what's food. They can smell predators. They can smell prey. They can go to the local tree or fire hydrant and they can identify which of their friends has visited there. And so for dogs, the sniff test tells them pretty much most of what they need to know about the world. But the sniff test, Bill Moyer says, is not very useful for telling you about God. And I kind of feel the same way about psychology. There's this line we can go up to with psychology, and it can tell us so much. But in terms of our spirituality, that's kind of a tall order for psychology. And, when I first went into grad school, that was where I kind of wanted to find psychology to give me some answers to. And it wasn't there. And I was kind of disappointed. And that's, again, kind of the story of this book, too, is how I came back after 30 years and realized there still is a story to tell that's useful. But I think one of the goals of a ceremonial magic I'll use as an example, but yoga and a lot of other practices as well is one of spiritual development. It's of becoming a more enlightened or a better version or the best version of yourself possible, to aspire to your best self. And these sorts of techniques that I talk about really do put you in this sort of altered state of mind where those sorts of changes can occur. As I mentioned, at the beginning of this interview, this idea that a transformative religious experience can change a personality, that may be kind of extreme, but these sorts of experiences we can make available to ourselves create this potential for that personal change, and that personal change can in fact also be spiritual. There's also, as you mentioned, there's also kind of like the mental sorts of changes that go on. In the book, I talk about how various practices can and are linked to better well-being, better adjustments. Not that this is like a substitute for actual proper medicine or mental health practice, but these practices do have benefits, and also practices like yoga will result in a more neural connections, more brain mass they've found. And the idea here is that if you have more brain mass earlier in life, that when you get older in life, when your brain mass starts to naturally sort of decline, that extra mass kind of gives you some additional protection. You've got a little bit more to lose before you suffer mental decline. So there's, physically a lot of benefits. But then that doesn't get into the idea of, can magic actually change the outside world? And there's a couple of ways I think we can talk about that. One is from the standpoint of psychologically, if we are empowered to act, then, we can better make those changes happen in our world. And I think it's the sense of empowerment and arming ourselves that's a valuable part of magical practice. And, one of the few ESP or paranormal research sorts of things I talk about is this meta-analysis originally done by Dean Radin, whose book, I just happen to have it here, Science of the Mind, just came out, or Science of Magic, I should say. But basically what he does is this big meta-analysis where he combines like a bunch of ESP research studies to average those results together in a way that's very common in medical research and get this net effect. And what he found in the original study, and then in Mind Over Magick, I use kind of I present a more expanded data set that someone else put together, they find that there really is a effect of ESP, but it's a very small one. It's like, it's like a percentage point or two, but it's statistically significant. So the argument there is that yes, you can kind of through ESP alter the odds in your favor, but a little bit. It's a nudge.
Mhm.
And I come back to one of my favorite quotes from Star Trek, again, which is part of my, the gateway to being an occultist, but Mr. Spock saying that chance favors the prepared mind. And so I kind of feel like, okay, if these techniques do kind of nudge the odds a little bit in your favor, that's not going to necessarily do it all for you. You've actually got to be ready to take advantage of the opportunity when it presents itself. So I think that's a big piece of it too, just to kind of be empowered and to, act, on that empowerment.
Sure, makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. And it's also about probabilities. I know Gordon White always talk about magic is about probability. And as you've spoken, well, so is sports, right? We try to,
Yeah,
baseball and football teams, they are doing the probability to get that perfect hit, that perfect game. And again, it's a form of magic.
And that's actually one of my favorite metaphors from one of Dean Radin's earlier books, The Conscious Universe, where he talks about how there's this problem of extreme skepticism regarding the sorts of research he does in parapsychology, is that skeptics want to see incontrovertible and reliably reproducible results.
Right.
And Dean Radin's argument is that these sorts of phenomena aren't necessarily going to happen 100% of the time. And his metaphor for this is that we will pay somebody millions of dollars so they can hit a ball with a stick 1 out of 3 times. So
And
by
we
that
love
extent, it kind of feels like, well, I'm being held to this unreasonable standard, compared to a baseball player.
And then there's a problem with the replication crisis too, right? Which has affected all these industries. Nobody seem to be able to replicate all these great studies. So yeah, don't throw stones.
Yeah, and that's one of the advantages of this meta-analysis sort of technique, because it does allow positive and negative studies to be kind of combined together and say, well, what's the picture that we do get when we put everything together? There's this idea, there's this file drawer problem they talk about, because significant results are sexy. They're more likely to get published. If you do a study and you find nothing, that's, an editor is going to say, well, that's not true. We can't devote the pages to that. And so there's this idea that there's probably some unknown number of non-significant results that exist for every significant finding. And taking account of that, when you do these sorts of meta-analysis is a big piece of that. But that's getting into the weeds.
Yeah. I was at a lecture with Hal Puthoff one time. Actually, it was on remote viewing at Xerox PARC. They were there when this was in the 80s. And he had a program that he ran on HP 41 calculator that if you had just a slightest amount of ESP, in other words, if you could predict something correctly more than 50% of the time, you could send a message to someone else, because it had to do with taking the say you have a piece of text and you encode it with error correcting code, and there was enough error correction so that after a long time, and it wasn't very efficient, you could actually pass the message to someone else mentally by doing this. It was very interesting.
And that actually reminds me of something else I talk about in the book. There are actually some studies of, in ESP researchers, there's a phenomenon called the sheep-goat effect, and the idea that, that sheep are, the people who believe in ESP, and goats are people who are skeptical. But part of the sheep-goat phenomenon that people have found is that folks who are participating, in these sorts of ESP studies, where you're guessing, the result of a coin toss or something, or, a Zener card, that people who believe in ESP do actually perform slightly better than chance. But on the flip side, they also find that people who are skeptical and do not believe in ESP actually tend to perform lower than chance. And so I think that's kind of an interesting story there about how, the beliefs that you bring to a situation affects, your performance or your experiences in the world. And so how does magic, influence the world? Well, there's kind of some data there that suggests, how that might happen. And I do think that, while there's this room to say that believers perhaps are a little too credulous or a little too eager to believe things that are hard to explain, that door swings the other way as well. And people who will never be satisfied with any amount of evidence for this kind of stuff are also people who are likely to reject good evidence. There are studies looking at, random strings of numbers versus systematic strings of numbers, and people who are skeptical tend to reject the actual, non-random string of numbers as being random more often than, chance would expect. So, again, it's kind of a double-edged sword. Too much credulousness is not a good thing, but too much skepticism also can blind you to the truth. So you kind of need to have a little bit of both, I think.
By the way, in put-off scheme, someone that could consistently perform worse than chance would be just as good a conduit, because you just reverse their answer. Say if it was binary, if he was predicting zeros and ones, you just flip everything that he said he'd to be doing better than chance. That's interesting.
I like, there's also one which jumped out at me, and that's the idea about initiation, about the severity of being initiated and how it increases your attraction. And the phenomena, you call it the severity attraction hypothesis. And could you explain that one? Because this goes beyond, this could go to cults, political parties, I don't know, anything.
Yeah, there's, when people join a group, they feel kind of a bond, particularly if they have to go through some sort of, process to become part of that group, an initiation, if you will. And there's two kind of common theories that explain this. One, just to kind of put it into lay people's terms, is you feel a bond with the group members if you feel like you've all gone through a similar ordeal to get there. And so it's like, yeah, we all have the same tattoo or whatever, it was. But there's also this severity attraction hypothesis, which has to do with this idea that going through the ordeal itself is what makes the group attractive, that you wouldn't have gone through that just to join a bunch of losers. So you went through some ordeal because they're awesome and cool, and now you're one of them. This does exist on a continuum, however, because it's possible to have too much of a bad thing in this case, where an ordeal at a proper level can, again, create this sort of bonding phenomenon. But if it goes too far, the ordeal becomes very unpleasant, and it can lead to disaffiliation, people having very bad attitudes about the group, not staying a member and whatnot. And there is this line that you cross between ordeal and hazing. And again, hazing is something that's kind of hard to define, but one of the characteristics of hazing is that, again, it is very severe and unpleasant, but it also has nothing to do with the group that you're trying to join. And it's often intended to degrade. Mm-hmm. And once you kind of cross the line to those sorts of behaviors, you're kind of no longer, fostering, good feelings about the group, but you're actually creating, that opportunity for people to actually move in the opposite direction. It's funny. I was just reading in the news this morning about a fraternity that was just shut down by the national chapter because someone was going through some sort of hazing and wound up hospitalized, and they haven't talked about what happened yet, but they just said, and water was involved. And I was reading this going, what's going on? But, obviously that's hazing gone too far, it's, and people do frequently get injured, hurts, or go through horrible experiences through these hazing processes, and which is, again, something very different from, an ordeal of initiation, which can actually build those sorts of bonds with the group you're joining.
Yeah, well, it should be like Animal House. You're singing Louie Louie with John Belushi would be enough. Then the other one, thank you, sir. Can I have another one? I don't know. I was thinking about Animal House. I guess we're all stuck in the late 70s right now.
Yeah.
But it's a classic. And what about, of course, within the occult community, there's always the argument of how ceremonial we should be, the ceremonial magicians. Then you've got the chaos magicians who are, let's just, do our sigils, charge them, and that's all we need. In the middle, like I'm reading Damon Brand, and I like how he's sort of a middle of the road. But what about these items and all the ceremonial? What's the psychology behind that, Richard? I mean, more than, again, magicians and athletes and having superstitions about their lucky object and all that. What's behind the ceremonial psychodrama?
Yeah. And, again, I'll start by saying that, there's this idea that's been put out by many people over the years that you don't need all that stuff, that, you can attain your enlightenment, for example, just through, yoga and meditation alone. But the idea here is that the ceremony, the garb, the implements, the bells and smells, and all those sorts of things, again, act as triggers. They help facilitate that altered state of mind that you're trying to get into. And there's, again, a lot of pieces there, as we talked earlier, the idea of the clothes that you're wearing or not wearing, as the case may be, has some bearing on, how you identify while you're going through that ritual. And there is research in psychology that talks about how clothing does affect your state of consciousness. There's one study I quote where someone puts on like a doctor's lab coat, and not only do they feel smarter, but there's actually tests of logic and intelligence that actually shows that they perform better when they're wearing the lab coat or if they're wearing a pair of glasses. Right. And so these sorts of things aren't just costume. They actually do change your state of mind. And the implements that you use, there's this idea that, the four standard weapons of the magician that you see on tarot cards, the suits of the tarot, the wand, the disc, the sword, and the cup, represent different things. The sword is the sharp intellect, of your mind. The cup is the well of your emotions, and the disc is, the physical world, literally money and things like that, and what you can do with resources. And your wand is your willpower. And that sounds like lovely metaphor, but when we look into consumer psychology, marketing psychology, psychologists have found that we literally do see our possessions as extensions of ourselves. Mm-hmm. And if we see that in terms of the brand of phone that we use or what have you, that for a magician, when they have a wand that they have gone through a lot of trouble to, procure in a certain way, a lot of these grimoire traditions say, your wand must be cut from a willow tree with a single stroke of a knife at midnight. And that might sound like ridiculous, but you're going to effort, you're putting trouble into this, and then you sand and you shape that wand and you paint it or you stain it and you seal it and you wrap it in silk and you treat it as something special. Mm-hmm. That wand does become an extension of your psyche, of yourself in a way, and even more so than the brand of cell phone that you have. because you are actually treating it as something very sacred. So it's, the idea that your wand represents your willpower is more than just a metaphor, that by holding these implements, you are arguably you are literally manipulating your consciousness. And so it's like all these pieces, you put them together, and it's, the one thing by itself may not be enough to kind of put you over the edge there, but, it's this kind of critical mass of things that your mind is processing. And, I would submit that it's when, a ritualist is in this setting where they are, manipulating these tools or wearing these clothes, they're smelling, incense they associate with certain things, they're doing these rituals that they practiced hundreds or thousands of times, and they're kind of in that flow state. That basically what's happening is you're kind of tied up your rational mind with all these,
Right.
Associations, the things that you're doing in the physical world, and that kind of leaves that more intuitive side, the liminal, side to come through, and that's where, those experiences become possible.
Yeah, I think, we want to participate and have extensions and make it worthwhile. I think going back to Bill Moore and The Power of Myth, Joseph Campbell always said religion is just reenacting the myth. And if we can reenact these great archetypal stories or reenact how Jesus is, then it will bring us a better life, maybe even a heroic life. And speaking again of marketing being magic, it reminds me of the story when Betty Crocker in the 50s came out with the instant cake, and it was a complete flop because it was all just pour it and water, and nobody bought it until they changed it and it said add an egg. Once the housewives were adding an egg, they felt like they were more participatory and alchemical in the whole
Yeah,
thing.
right. The idea there was just add water was
like
cheating. It wasn't, it wasn't enough effort.
So that's part of it. Vince, do you have a question?
Oh no, I was just thinking about adding eggs to things. It sounds good to me. Sounds pretty tasty.
Yeah.
Did have a question, but the egg chased it away.
Chased it away. Well, there is a.
I know what it was. I was going to say, when you dress up and have all these accoutrements and things, it actually is conditioning your identity. Yeah, you actually feel like Halloween. Now is a good time to talk about this. Halloween is a good example, right? People dress up in costumes, and if they're, like if you dress up like Elvis, you're going to feel like Elvis. Hey, hooka bucka, whatever. And I dressed up as a wizard many years ago, and I had my wand, and I did magic tricks and so forth. And I felt like a wizard, for that night. Another time, I dressed up as a devil. I had the pitchfork and had red makeup on and everything, and I went all night, and I felt devilish. So I know what you mean.
Yeah, there's actually a Looney Tunes cartoon. I really wanted to get to include a picture from this cartoon in the book, but I couldn't get the rights to this one. But there's a Bugs Bunny cartoon called Bugs's Bonnets. And in this particular one, it's set up like, it starts off as a sort of mock, psychology documentary. And what happens is there's this hat truck going down the road, and it hits a pothole. The back of the truck flies open, and all these hats come, flying out the back of the truck. Mm-hmm. And meanwhile, what's happening is the typical, Elmer Fudd is chasing Bugs Bunny. But these hats start landing on their heads, and every time a hat lands on their head, they kind of take on the personality associated with that hat. And while it's silly, it's a cartoon, but it also kind of speaks to this idea that what we wear does affect our consciousness. And it kind of, in the book, it kind of dovetails into a discussion of like the Stanford Prison experiments and how, the roles that we're kind of placed into, the roles that we take on, can affect how we perceive ourselves and how we behave and so on.
Maybe we should dress all our people in jail in suits and ties instead of stripes.
And
big stripes underneath black. Yeah.
I also like when you're talking about sense presence or the third man factor. And of course, you bring in Jung and his meaning of Philemon, his his guide into the underworld.
Right.
What is that as a magician or in general, Richard?
Well, I think it's again, it speaks to this interesting phenomenon that is often reported by magicians do go into this isn't the only thing they do, but oftentimes they will go into a temple and they will try to evoke to visible appearance some spirit, some whether it be some angel or some demon from the Goetia or whatever. And there are also experiences where people have just felt a spirit over their shoulder, speaking to them. And this is, again, a pretty common sort of experience. In my book, I kind of talk about a specific example that Crowley describes of this entity, Aiwass, dictated this book of the law to him.
Mm-hmm.
But it really fits the experience of this third man effect, the idea that you have this feeling of somebody who is there, who is not quite there, but you feel that presence. And it's like, you can't look directly at them, but they're there and they're just behind you. And this often happens to people in kind of remote and difficult situations. The examples that we often hear about are things like mountain climbers who are, up in a snowy area by themselves, and they've kind of got this sensory deprivation thing going on. So it's just like this, solid snowscape. There's not a whole lot of sensory input going on there, but you're also struggling with the ordeal. But this sort of sensed presence or third man effect does show up in other places. And this whole there's a writer who kind of wrote a couple of books on the third man effect that kind of talks about how this also can apply to experiences people have of encountering a guardian angel or a divine experience. And one of the experiences that in some schools of magic talk about is this idea that you're aspiring through your spiritual advancement to get in touch with your holy guardian angel. That once you achieve that, you've kind of united with, again, your higher self or your personal, divine, part of yourself or what have you. And so in some sense, the idea that there's this psychological phenomenon that kind of matches to that, again, talks to how that third man effect can kind of facilitate that experience of that, knowledge and conversation of your holy guardian angel or what have you. But, again, you're talking about Philemon, for Jung, as I mentioned, Aiwass for Crowley, and so this is something that we see popping up repeatedly through, or among ceremonial magic practitioners.
Mm-hmm. And as we get to the end, I wanted to ask you, my last question was, how does the evolutionary tendency known as patternicity relate to both everyday human experience and magic in general? I think that's an important one to understand.
Yeah. We have what some people might call a hyperactive agency detective device in our psyches. We are evolved to recognize patterns in our environment. It's survival smart. We can recognize when Drock ate that berry, Drock died. I should not eat that berry. And similarly, and also, but when we see her, rustling in a bush, we want to assess whether that is a threat, to our existence or not. And so there's also this tendency not only to recognize patterns, but also to recognize agenticity. If there's something going on, is there something behind it? And this applies in a lot of ways to human psychology. And that's, where to begin? This tendency to see agency behind things, again, is protective because we want to be able to recognize when there is a threat in our environment, but we also that often translates into trying to assign agency to something that is purely random or coincidence. And I think that kind of speaks to this idea of also being a critical evaluator of things. And again, this patternicity is kind of behind this phenomenon of synchronicity that we talked about. Synchronicity being recognizing a meaningful coincidence between things. But again, there's also that tendency to want to see patterns where perhaps none exist. And that ability to kind of critically assess your world is kind of important. And again, comes back to that idea that I talked about earlier about finding that balance point between being credulous and believing and being open to new experiences, because that's the situation in which these sorts of experiences can happen. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, being rational and having a certain amount of skepticism about it all can kind of keep you kind of on that sane sort of straight and narrow.
Makes sense. Well, we are getting at the end again. This is a Patreon AB Prime a special stream exclusive, much earlier than usually it will be put out days earlier. So again, if you're listening to the recording, or please support Aeon Byte. I do a few of these a month beyond our regularly scheduled show. And it's been a great conversation. Vance, any last question or comment from you before we say adieu?
Yeah, I've got a interesting question. Hopefully we'll make it a short answer since we're near the end here. But have you ever heard... Oh, don't ask? Oh, no, I have to ask.
I'll do my best. Go ahead.
Oh, you'll do your best. Okay. Sorry, misheard that. Have you ever heard of people using virtual reality for their magical environments? In other words, you can have, virtual wands and cups and virtual temples and so forth. Is that becoming popular these days?
Yeah. And then also there's a PRX show that was out for a couple of seasons very recently called I'm trying to think. I think it's Magic in the USA, and the host of the show is very interested in the uses of technology in magic, and I think they actually have an episode all about that. I was actually interviewed on one episode as a bulletin board sysop back in the day.
Oh, cool!
But people have actually done online rituals, and they're different from getting together in a group and doing these things in real time, but in some of these forums, where people would kind of log in and they would say something or post something, and people would react to it over the course of, hours or days. And so those sorts of practices do occur. And so I wouldn't, discount that. People will always find ways of using the tech that's available to them. One of the things I do talk about in the book, however, is that there are also psychological and physiological things that happen when you do get together in a group, that physically in a group, that do not happen virtually. So, again, you can do that, and that's going to work. But there's also some things, some of the, physiological thinking up sorts of things that can happen when you're in a group and live, that won't happen when you're in this sort of virtual setting. But but it works. People have been doing it as long as there's been an internet.
Yeah.
Great, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and thanks for keeping us company, Vance, on this magical journey.
You bet.
And Richard, I have your website and a link to the book on the show notes, regardless of where people are watching or listening to, if that's their choice. Anywhere else you want to send people, any event or anything else going on, or just send them to your homepage?
Yeah, come to my homepage. I'm kind of at the end of a lot of my lectures and appearances for the year, but we'll see where next year goes. But again, my website or social medias, I'm on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky. Come find me, and if you're interested, and you can keep up on where I'm going to be and what I'm going to be doing in the future.
Awesome. Yes. Check it out. And yeah, very good book. We only scratch the surface. A lot of more great science and research and a few anecdotes, great anecdotes there in the book, but it's all there and it's a great book, and which I thoroughly enjoyed. So check out Richard's website and check out Mind Over Magick, the Psychology of Ritual Magick. And Richard, we really appreciate you coming on the show and giving us your time. And yeah, thanks for being here and appreciate it.
Well, you're most welcome. Thank you for the opportunity.
And
Take
for
care.
everybody else, yeah, thanks for being here. If you're watching live and if you're watching the recording, I hope you're enjoying it as well. And as I always say, yeah, beyond making magic, write your own gospel, live your own myth. Take care, everybody.